the thing about the global climate uh, landscape is that nothing we know today can help us predict what's going to happen tomorrow. But having said that, we're in a landscape and we're in a sort of ecosystem that is making it more likely or facilitating the resort to armed conflict. It's shaping conflicts in a way that makes it easier or more likely that they end up in armed conflict rather than uh, negotiations or compromises or brokered solutions. And I think that there was a lot of backlash against the idea that, for instance, the attack of Hamas on October 7th uh, had anything to do with the global order and the erosion of the international order, and particularly these norms against aggression and against armed conflict. And the obvious argument is that Hamas has been doing this for years. There's been years of sporadic conflict between Israel and Hamas. So you don't need a smoking gun in terms of text messages or IMs among the Hamas leadership saying, "Look, China's making inroads in the Middle East. Now's our time to act."
Yeah.
That's not really how this works. However, uh, there were quoted reporting of Hamas's leadership saying the global environment right now is actually propitious for a strategic breakthrough. And the reason that it's obvious to them is that it's obvious to everyone. You have the U.S. with its hands full, trying to keep the NATO alliance unified and cohesive, trying to keep Europe on board, trying to keep House Republicans on board with supporting Ukraine against Russia, while it's also trying to kind of create this coalition to counter China's growing influence. You have China that is, in fact, making inroads into the Middle East and wants to be a bigger actor there. And you have all these tensions, and then you also have, in the immediate run-up, you have in the past 2-3 years, you have Azerbaijan resorting to force to settle a decades-long territorial conflict and dispute. You have Russia in Ukraine. You have the wars in Ethiopia that no one really cared about, the internal civil wars in Ethiopia that really dragged on horrifically for 2 years in Tigray, and are still continuing in other regions. And so you have all these things going on where uh, very clearly there's going to be opportunistic actors saying, you know what, we're tired of it. We're going to try to settle this dispute now once and for all. And we see with Venezuela and Guyana, even though it's very unlikely that Venezuela will do anything that rash. It's rattling the sabers because it seems to be what people do now. I do think that the global security order is going to be very increasingly severely strained, and one of the reasons why is because setting aside any sort of utopian retrospective portrayals of the liberal international order, um, there was a norm toward multilateral uh, peacemaking, multilateral negotiations, a real sort of off ramp to conflict and mobilization when it began. This sense that we really have multilateral channels uh, to work with, and in some ways that started breaking down with the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria, with regard to Russia's obstructionism. The U.S. obviously, the invasion of Iraq, you can trace it back to that as well. Libya was a little more of a multilateral consensus, but clearly overstepped in terms of the mandate, the UN mandate. This isn't stuff that just all of a sudden overnight happened, but it's this accumulation of details and accumulation of factors that I think ends up eventually reaching, the famous tipping point or inflection point, and then all of a sudden, the difference of quantity becomes a difference of quality.